learners, welcome back to this online study session on the Scarlet Letter. In the introductory session on the Scarlet Letter, we had discussed the importance of this text and why this text qualifies as a classic work in the field of American literature. Continuing the same tradition, in this session we will look at how the text has been appreciated and received since the time of its inception, and we will look at some of the important critical aspects of the text and how it has stood the test of the time. So without further ado, let us begin. Many works thought to be literary classics in their time have disappeared from view, while other works ignored in their day have resurfaced as classics in later times. The Scarlet Letter is one of the rare American works that, recognized as a classic at once, has also remained in print constantly from first appearance to the present. In fact, it was recognized as a classic even before publication, when James T. Fields, one of the three partners in the firm that published Hawthorne's works, read the manuscript. It was he who persuaded the self-doubting author to allow him to publish it as a single separate work rather than in a mixed collection of short pieces, as had been Hawthorne's original intention. Fields' enthusiasm was particularly striking in that the work was truly defective in just the way Hawthorne thought it was. It was not a mixture of bright and dark, sunshine and shadow, humor and pathos, as the taste of the time preferred. Rather, it was intense and single in its stress on the dark, the somber, the gloomy. It is positively a hell-fired story into which I found it almost impossible to throw any cheering light, Hawthorne wrote to a close friend at the time that he finished the work. The sentence suggests that far from realizing his own intentions, which were to write something pleasing and popular with plenty of variety, the Scarlet Letter had stubbornly gone its own way in the creation. Thus, when he read the conclusion to his wife, he was jubilant to discover how deeply it affected her. It broke her heart and sent her to bed with a grievous headache, which I look upon as a triumphant success, he wrote in the same letter. Judging from its effect on her and the publisher, I may calculate on what bowlers can call a 10 strike. A 10 strike it was, for far as Hawthorne's reputation was concerned, for with the publication of the Scarlet Letter, he was instantly elevated to the position of the nation's foremost man of letters. But the popularity that he greatly desired for financial reasons, and because he had always thought of writing as a way of establishing community with an audience, did not come with this or any other work. The book did not sell much over 13,500 copies between publication and Hawthorne's death 13 years later. His total royalties amounted to little more than $1,500. Even allowing for the uninflated dollar, this sum cannot be regarded as a significant success. Hawthorne has owned his continuing reputation to the appreciation with which a small but influential audience has responded to his work, above all to the Scarlet Letter. Such an audience had first come into being during the 1840s and was chiefly composed of literary critics who wrote for magazines and newspapers. They had appreciated his 1837 Twice Told Tales enough to induce him to republish the work in an expanded edition in 1842. And this had provingly read his new writings as they appeared in John L. Sullivan's United States Magazine and Democratic Review in the 1840s, and welcomed the 1846 collection Moses from an Old Manse. These critics were hoping to find an American writer of fiction with a distinct national flavor, who was good enough to be proposed seriously as an equal to the great English and French novelists of the 1840s, among whom were Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, Elizabeth Gaskell, Victor Hugo, and Alexander Dumas. James Fenimore Cooper had fallen from favor because he had abandoned his popular leather stocking series and other historical subjects to write polemic novels strongly critical of American democracy. Catherine Sedgwick, who had been thought equal to Cooper as a historical novelist in the 1820s, had abandoned novel writing for didactic tracts. Edgar Allan Poe, who died in 1849, refused to write novels because he believed in the importance of a unity of effect that was only attainable in works that could be read in a single sitting. Herman Melville, a recent and promising arrival on the literary scene with TP in 1846, had quickly become too wild and metaphysical for contemporary critical taste. The Scarlet Letter was not quite the kind of work that critics had been looking for, but they were prepared to be flexible if they could satisfy and safely announce it as a major American novel. In addition, a political scandal had broken around Hawthorne just before he began work on the Scarlet Letter. His patronage appointment to the Salem Custom House, which had been assured to him regardless of which party was in power, was terminated when the Whigs beat out the Democrats late in 1848. A highly respected literary man thus found himself unemployed with a family to support in 1849. And Hawthorne accompanied the text of the Scarlet Letter with a long prefatory essay called The Custom House that provided a satirical account of life in the custom house as well as his dismissal. This topical material assured that the book would be well publicized, even though critics might concentrate on the custom house rather than the Scarlet Letter. It assured that reviews of the book would be widely read, and not only by people interested in literature. Some were ready to defend the author, others to defend his being fired. Some people approved of his putting his reactions into print, others thought it unseeming of him to have done so. But in any event, the Custom House gave Hawthorne wide publicity. In fact, regardless of their political alignments, leading critics of the day generally reviewed the Scarlet Letter very favorably, concentrating on its stylistic and formal perfection, its intensity of effect, its insight into the human soul, its pathos and power, its mixture of solemnity and tenderness, severity and sympathy. While they might have preferred a work of more humor and playfulness, they found in the Scarlet Letter a tragic essence worthy of a major writer and happily ranked Hawthorne with leading 19th century European authors. The hostile reviews came from critics with a strong religious orientation who deemed the author's choice of subject, an adulterous couple, immoral in itself regardless of the author's treatment. Many of these thought, in addition, that Hawthorne had treated his sinners too sympathetically in a manner likely to encourage similar immorality among readers. Hawthorne's subsequent novels were compared as a matter of course with the Scarlet Letter. A number of critics preferred The House of the Seven Gables. So did Hawthorne, who wrote in a letter that it was a more natural and healthy product of my mind, and that he felt less reluctance in publishing it than he did the Scarlet Letter because it was a more cheerful book with a more varied tone. Over time, however, the Scarlet Letter came to be recognized as the best of his works as well as the one that, notwithstanding Hawthorne's own self-analysis, most represented his literary methods and concerns. In the decades after Hawthorne's death, a group of prestigious Boston-based literary critics worked tirelessly to maintain his reputation as a foremost American writer. Once again, certain extraneous factors were at work, chiefly the desire of these critics to develop a canon of national literature centering on New England writers. In the 1880s, when Houghton Mifflin, a Boston publishing company, began to put out elegant editions of the major American writers, Hawthorne was among the first to be featured. The success of this effort of critics and publishers can be measured by the fact that beginning with Henry James, whose long essay on Hawthorne appeared in 1879, numerous aspiring novelist critics including James, William Dean Howells, D.H. Lawrence, George Lube Wards, and John Updike have felt the need to engage with and write about Hawthorne's achievement. And every general critical study of American literature includes extended discussion on Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter. James described the Scarlet Letter as the finest piece of imaginative writing yet put forth in the country. In assessing it, he took an approach often repeated in criticism through the years, identifying it as much with general New England culture as with the author's particular sensibility. It belonged to the soil, to the air, it came out of the very heart of New England, he said. While denying that the work was a historical novel in the normal sense, the historical coloring is rather weak than otherwise. There is little elaboration on detail of the modern realism of research. James added that, nevertheless, Puritanism is there not only objectively, as Hawthorne had tried to place it there, but subjectively as well, in the very quality of his own vision. By Puritanism, James did not imply any particular theology, but rather the intellectual, allegorical quality of the work, what he called its element of cold and ingenious fantasy, its elaborate imaginative delicacy, which he attributed to the passionless reserve of Hawthorne's New England temperament. During the last 30 years of the 19th century, literary critics elaborated on an idea of fiction as inclining either to a realist or to a romantic practice, and Hawthorne came to figure as the ultimate romantic. The difference between these two modes was not in the choice of subject matter, which was assumed to be truths of human life, but in the relation between these truths and the imagined facts that constituted the fiction. The realist worked inductively like a scientist, beginning with observed facts of life and working from them to his truths. The romantic worked deductively in the reverse direction, beginning with certain truths and using the facts of his story to illustrate them. A distinction like this might explain why Hawthorne could lean so heavily on the fantastic, the supernatural, the symbolic, and the allegorical, and yet create a sense of truth as strong as in any realistic novel. Over time, and perhaps inaccurately, the tradition of American fiction came to be associated with romantic practice, which led to the institution of the Scarlet Letter as the very fountainhead of a truly American fiction. This is an ironic development since Hawthorne often claimed that his imagination was un-American in its preference for the romantic. In its role as the quintessential American novel, The Scarlet Letter was attacked as often as it was defended, for numerous important novelists of the later 19th century set themselves firmly in the realist camp. Among them, such important critics as William Dean Howells, a great admirer of Hawthorne, who nevertheless regarded him as an influence to be overcome. But every essay that criticized the Scarlet Letter for excessive fantasy or lack of realism testified to its continuing and powerful presence on the literary horizon. The Scarlet Letter continues to be accepted without argument as an indisputable fictional masterwork of the pre-Civil War era, and this recognition underlies all criticism in the 20th century. Between the turn of the 20th century and the World War II, much discussion of Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter had a biographical emphasis, viewing the novel less in and for itself than as an index to the fascinating psyche of its author. Behind a variety of up-to-date psychological theories, such criticism accurately returned to the question that the earliest reviews had raised: the question that had so worried Hawthorne himself, whether the author and his works were excessively gloomy. The concern in the Scarlet Letter with the isolation of particular human beings from the larger society and the reasons for that isolation, as well as the focus on secrets and guilt, were taken as expressions of Hawthorne's personal maladjustment, and critics searched the biographical records for explanation. Some found it in the absent father who had died almost before Hawthorne could remember him, some in an allegedly eccentric and withdrawn mother, others in the foot injury that kept him from active play at a crucial time in his youth, others in the oppressive New England heritage. Another group of critics dealt with Hawthorne's supposed morbidity by arguing that he was not in the least morbid but was a well-balanced man in both his life and his works. Still, others maintained that the crucial and critical demand for cheer and balance was naive and narrow. A powerful way of accounting for the differing critical responses that a reading of the Scarlet Letter obviously produced was to stress Hawthorne's ambiguity. That is, the way in which he makes it difficult or impossible to extract a clear and particular message from his work. Studies of the means by which such ambiguity was achieved became, in the 1950s, the chief way of investigating the text itself. The upshot of such studies was a supplanting of the view of Hawthorne as romantic allegorist, since allegory is a technique for imposing single clear meanings, with the idea of Hawthorne as a symbolist. In line with such a change, critics grew less interested in Hawthorne's use of earlier sources like Milton, Spencer, John Bunyan, and all the likes, and more interested in his influence on later writers, where he had often been thought of as creating a deliberately archaic kind of fiction. He was now perceived in the opposite light as the forerunner of various modern techniques. An important 1957 study by Charles Fieldson, Symbolism in American Literature, made this point especially strongly. Some critics, accepting the notion of Hawthorne's personal isolation in life and its causative power in his work, attributed his situation to shortcomings in society rather than in the man. More specifically, they pointed either to his descent from the obligatory optimism of mid-19th century America, which required belief in progress and human perfectibility as articles of faith, or to his difficult situation as a serious artist in a society that loved trivia. In such interpretations as blame shifts from Hawthorne to society, emphasis veers from the psychological to the sociological, and Hawthorne begins to be understood not as an explorer of general human truths, but as a social critic. This is probably the most important development in criticism of the Scarlet Letter in the last 40 years, but it shares with the biographical criticism a desire to fold the particular work into a larger field of inquiry. The blending of an earlier idea of Hawthorne's romantic method in the Scarlet Letter with a later sense of his presumed social purpose received one of its strongest and most influential statements in Richard Chase's 1957 study titled The American Novel and Its Tradition. This work had its prime goal to establish a distinction between American and British fiction. Chase called The Scarlet Letter an allegorical novel whose allegory, both in form and substance, derives from Puritanism, and whose theme is the loss of submergence of emotion involved in the abandonment of the old world cultural heritage. Again, however, the characteristics of the work itself came into play because interpretations of the Scarlet Letter as social commentary could not escape the text's ambiguity any more than could the biographical criticism. Where one critic, for example Hayat Wagner in Hawthorne, a Critical Study, might present Hawthorne as an old-fashioned conservative who did not believe in human goodness and who exploited Puritanism as a corrective to his age. Another critic, like D.H. Lawrence in Studies in Classical American Literature, might argue with equal force and passion that the Scarlet Letter was a profound, although disguised, attack on an emotionally impoverishing and hypocritical American moralism. Hawthorne's ambiguity entered Chase's interpretation too, in that Chase decided Hawthorne had not committed himself as to whether the loss of the old world heritage was good or bad for Americans. Following Chase, any number of critics from Joel Port, The Romance in America 1969, to Michelle Davitt Bell, The Development of American Romance 1981, have interpreted the Scarlet Letter as a work whose form is particularly American, whose point is to criticize society from an alienated perspective that reflects Hawthorne's personal and professional situation. Along with the interest in assimilating the Scarlet Letter to more general inquiry, biographical and social criticism share an approach to the work as an entity to be interpreted. This approach is strikingly different from that prevailing in Hawthorne's own time, where the work was considered in relation to its ability to engage reader emotions, not as a text encoding a message for the intellect to decipher. The many critics in the second half of the 20th century who have restricted their view to the text itself have also shared this preoccupation with interpretation and have attempted to come up with a basic and correct meaning for the Scarlet Letter. The two questions have especially preoccupied them. One is whether Hawthorne's worldview is essentially religious or secular, whether he thinks that his characters have sinned in the sense of breaking a divine commandment, or whether instead he thinks they have broken a social law. A second connected question is, which characters does Hawthorne sympathize with and why? Answers to these questions vary widely. There are those who see Hester as an out-and-out secular heroine, standing up for the individual against arbitrary authority, and those who see her as a religious sinner, adding pride and anger to her original trespass. Those who are committed to a secular reading to Hawthorne take the Scarlet Letter as a powerful psychological study of the inner life. Those committed to a religious reading find its strength rather in Hawthorne's rejection of his characters' rationalizations, his adherence to an ethical absolutism based on belief in a firm divine order that takes precedence over human desire. The fact that critics could come up with so many different yet defensible readings of the Scarlet Letter eventually led again to the matter of Hawthorne's ambiguity, but with a few new twists. Some contemporary critics now believe that ambiguity is inescapable in all linguistic texts because language itself is inherently unstable, including the language in which critics make their arguments. No interpretation can never be definitively established as the right one. Even those who prefer to think of language as more solid than this may agree that the world of complex fictional text like the Scarlet Letter is bound to be so resonant and rich in connotations that different readers will necessarily have different responses. Some responses will be overtly personal and hence unauthorized by the text, but many will simply be based on sensitivities to different elements in the mixture. For example, in recent years, feminist critics have turned to the Scarlet Letter because it is one of the few acknowledged American masterworks from before the Civil War whose main character is a woman. A feminist perspective allows one to see how Hawthorne was concerned in developing Hester with the question of the status of women in society, as well as the different commitments men and women tend to make to romantic love. Since romantic love serves Hester so badly, they can identify a previously unnoticed aspect of Hawthorne's social criticism, the idea of romantic love as a trick to ensure the willing subservience of women to the social system. This feminist perspective responds to elements truly there but completely invisible to those looking only for a theological statement in the novel. Perhaps then, the most exciting thing about the Scarlet Letter is not that we can translate it into a core meaning, but that it is full of meanings, though a dead work if it is not read, it comes to life for each reader in a slightly different way, just as human beings do for each other. The elusiveness of the text is thus the essential reason for its continuing fascination throughout the years. Unlike simpler works that are skimmed and discarded when we have extracted their message once and for all, the Scarlet Letter creates a world that we each enter in our own way, indeed, that each of us may enter in different ways at different points in our lives. We do not surrender to an anarchistic subjectivity here. Rather, we recognize that interpretation is not the last word in an encounter with the great work of literature. If it were, we would never return to a masterpiece after we had learned its message, and it would have no capacity to move us after the first reading. Thank you.